Beneath the waves lie the drowned archives of our planet's past. Ancient harbor cities, once bustling centers of trade and power, now rest silently on the sea floor. They are not just ruins, they are direct physical records of the Earth's changing climate, holding secrets of rising seas and shifting coasts locked in their stones and sediments. This journey moves beyond legend into the realm of concrete scientific evidence, investigating how these sunken metropolises serve as undeniable indicators of environmental change. We will explore the tension between their creation as pinnacles of human culture and their eventual fate as climate sentinels. By the end, you will understand how to read the story of our planet's climatic shifts written in the ruins of lost civilizations. What caused a major Egyptian port to vanish into the Mediterranean? And how does a city submerged for over 5,000 years recalibrate our entire timeline of sea level rise? The answers rewrite history. When you look at our modern coastlines, what do you see? A permanent frontier or a temporary boundary in an ancient, ongoing story? This distinction is crucial for reading the Earth story accurately. Some cities are placed underwater intentionally, like a modern reservoir town flooded for a dam, a deliberate act of engineering. The ruins we are seeking are different. They were submerged by the natural world itself, not by human design. These are the unintentional records, the places where the sea arrived as an uninvited and unstoppable guest. Their value lies not merely in their location beneath the waves, but in the precise story of how they got there. The evidence they hold tells us about the rate of the water's rise, the specific cause of their drowning, and the entire environmental context of their final days. So what exactly are scientists looking for when they study these sites? It begins with the most obvious clues, the architectural remains. Collapsed walls and toppled columns found far from any modern shore are a stark first indicator. But more telling is the harbor infrastructure itself. Ancient breakwaters, quays, and slipways, engineered to be at the water's edge, now lie meters deep, a clear sign that the shoreline has retreated inland. Then we look deeper into the very ground the city was built upon. Sediment layers act like a geologic diary. A sudden, thick layer of sand or silt piled atop a street level can point to a catastrophic event, like a tsunami or a massive storm surge. Conversely, a slow, steady accumulation of fine mud might tell a tale of gradual, relentless sea level rise. Perhaps the most elegant evidence comes not from stone, but from life. Biological markers serve as nature's own recording instruments. Coral, for instance, can only grow in specific depths of clear, sunlit water. Finding ancient coral colonies thriving on top of a sunken city wall gives scientists a precise depth gauge for the sea level at the time it grew. Similarly, the discovery of drowned peat beds, the remains of freshwater coastal marshes, indicates where dry land once existed before being overtaken by salt water. Each piece of evidence, from a massive stone block to a tiny fossilized plant, is a data point. The true narrative emerges not from any single artifact, but from the collective testimony of the ruins, revealing whether a city fell in a sudden cataclysm or slipped beneath the waves over generations. This context turns a sunken city from a mere curiosity into a calibrated instrument for measuring planetary change. To transform a silent ruin into a speaking witness, we must first ask it a simple question. When did this happen? The answer is not written on a calendar, but locked within the materials of the city itself, and science holds the keys. Determining the precise moment a harbor slipped beneath the waves is a meticulous process of cross-examination, using multiple dating methods to build an irrefutable case. One of the most powerful tools is radiocarbon dating. This technique analyzes organic materials trapped in the moment of the city's abandonment. Think of a wooden post from a dock, a seed stored in a sunken grain jar, or even the bones of a fish left in a marketplace. All living things absorb a tiny, predictable amount of a radioactive form of carbon from the atmosphere. When they pass away, that absorption stops, and the radioactive carbon begins to decay at a steady, measurable rate. By measuring how much remains in the sample, scientists can calculate with remarkable precision when that organism was last alive. This gives us a date very close to the time the city was active, and by extension when it was ultimately submerged. But what about the non-organic evidence, like the very sands that buried the streets? For that, researchers use a method called optically stimulated luminescence, often shortened to OSL. This ingenious technique dates the last time a grain of sand or sediment was exposed to sunlight. When minerals like quartz are buried, they accumulate energy from natural background radiation in the earth. In a laboratory, scientists can stimulate these grains with light, causing them to release that stored energy as a faint glow. The intensity of that luminescence reveals how long the grain has been in darkness. So, a layer of sand that smothered a coastal road, sealing it from the sun for millennia, can be dated to reveal exactly when that catastrophic storm or surge occurred. Another method, dendrochronology, uses the patterns in tree rings. If timbers from a sunken ship or a building are recovered, their unique sequence of wide and narrow rings, shaped by years of good and bad climate, can be matched to a master chronology. This can tell us not only the exact year the tree was cut down, but often the season, offering a stunningly precise timestamp for construction or repair just before the deluge. Each method alone provides a clue, but the true power lies in correlation. By dating multiple samples from the same event layer using different techniques, scientists achieve a robust, verified timeline. This timeline is then placed alongside other global records, like ice core data from Greenland or sediment cores from the deep ocean, which chronicle past temperatures and atmospheric conditions. This is the final, crucial step. It transforms a solitary date into a data point on the graph of Earth's climate history. We no longer see just a city that drowned. We see a city that drowned during a specific period of rapid glacial melt, or at the peak of a known warm phase. The ruin stops being a lonely mystery and becomes a confirmed marker, a benchmark in the planet's long story of environmental change, giving profound context to the forces that rewrote the map. The timeline of a sunken city is its first confession, but its layout tells the entire story of its life and slow demise. Off the southern coast of Greece, near a place called Pavlopetri, lies a city that offers both in extraordinary measure. Its streets, courtyards, and tombs are so perfectly preserved on the seafloor that it looks less like a ruin and more like a ghostly blueprint, a map of a community frozen in time. Archaeologists have mapped its entire plan, revealing a sophisticated settlement with two-story buildings, a central marketplace, and even a complex water management system. This is not a city that was violently destroyed. It is a place that was gently, patiently reclaimed by the sea. The key to its story lies in its incredible age. Pavlopetri was a thriving port during the early Bronze Age, over 5,000 years ago. Its submergence acts as a long-term benchmark, a physical record of sea level change spanning millennia. The primary force at work here was the immense global process that began at the end of the last ice age. As continental glaciers melted, they released vast quantities of water back into the oceans, causing sea levels to rise worldwide. Pavlopetri's gradual drowning is a direct, local measurement of that planetary scale event. But there is another, more regional factor at play. The land here is also slowly sinking due to tectonic subsidence as the Earth's crust adjusts over immense timescales. The combination of these two forces, the global rise of the water and the local sinking of the land, created a perfect and inevitable fate for this coastal settlement. Its streets did not flood in a storm. They were incrementally, generation by generation, abandoned to the advancing shoreline. This slow motion process fundamentally changes our understanding of its era. For Pavlopetri to have been a functional harbor 5 millennia ago, the coastline must have extended much further out than it does today. Its location, now surrounded by open water, suggests it was once part of a much larger, now submerged coastal plain. This reshapes the map of early Bronze Age maritime trade. What we see today as isolated islands may have been connected by lost peninsulas or protected by bays that no longer exist. The trade routes we assume ancient sailors used, hugging the modern coast, might have been far more direct, crossing what are now open stretches of sea. Pavlopetri's ruins challenge us to see a lost geography, a world where the sea was a smaller player and the land offered more connections. It forces a humbling realization. The stable coastlines we depend on today are, in the grand timeline of our planet, merely a snapshot. A city that traded with the Minoans and watched the pyramids being built now rests in silent testimony to the one constant of our world, its capacity for profound and lasting change. While Pavlopetri reveals a slow, geological fate, other cities met a far more dramatic end. The story of Thonis-Heracleion, a legendary gateway to Egypt, reads like a historical thriller. For centuries, this port was considered a myth, a place mentioned by ancient historians like Herodotus but lost to time. Then, in the year 2000, underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio made a discovery that stunned the world. His team, surveying the murky waters of Baia Bay near modern Alexandria, suddenly saw a colossal stone face emerge from the shadows. It was a statue of the god Hapi, deity of the Nile flood, over 5 meters tall and perfectly preserved. They had found the drowned heart of a metropolis. Thonis-Heracleion was not just a port, it was the mandatory customs gateway for all trade entering Egypt from the Greek world. Every ship, every merchant, every tribute passed through this city, making it unimaginably wealthy and powerful. The seabed here is an underwater museum of staggering scale. Teams have recovered 70 ancient ships, some still resting in their slips, colossal statues of a pharaoh and a queen, each weighing over 4 tons, and dozens of inscribed stone slabs called stelae. One such slab, bearing the decree of Sais, helped confirm the city's dual identity, known as Thonis to the Egyptians and Heracleion to the Greeks. Gold coins, delicate jewelry, and ritual objects speak to a city in its prime, a bustling, cosmopolitan hub where cultures and goods converge. So how does such a vital, stone-built center simply vanish beneath the sea? The answer is a perfect and tragic storm of environmental forces. Thonis-Heracleion did not succumb to a single disaster, but to a chain of them, beginning around the 8th century AD. First, the very ground it stood on became unstable. The city was constructed on the shifting sediments of the Nile Delta, a landscape constantly built and reshaped by the river's silt. Major earthquakes, which are known to have struck the region, likely triggered a phenomenon called soil liquefaction. In this process, the water-saturated, sandy ground temporarily loses its strength and behaves like a liquid, causing massive structures to tilt, sink, or collapse catastrophically. This instability was compounded by the slow, relentless subsidence of the entire delta region. The immense weight of new sediment deposited by the Nile over millennia causes the older layers beneath to compact and sink. But here, climate enters the story as a crucial actor. Research suggests that changes in rainfall patterns far to the south in the African interior led to periods of reduced Nile flooding. With less fresh sediment arriving to replenish and stabilize the delta's edges, the land became more vulnerable to subsidence and erosion. At the same time, global sea levels were continuing their slow, post-ice age rise. The Mediterranean began to press in on the weakened coastline with increasing force. The fate of Thonis-Heracleion was sealed by this convergence, a sinking land meeting a rising sea. What began with earthquake-damaged foundations ended with the sea slowly flooding the streets, swallowing temples and toppling monuments over perhaps a few hundred years. The city did not slide into the depths in a day, but it was a doomed process, an environmental trap from which there was no escape. Its ruins provide a physical case study in multi-causal collapse, where geology, climate, and human geography intertwine to rewrite the map. One wonders what the last residents thought, watching the water claim their proud city stone by stone, a slow-motion disappearance that would render their home a legend for 1,000 years. The story of Thonis-Heracleion shows us how a city can be undone by a chain of environmental pressures, but another sunken port presents an even deeper mystery, one woven directly into sacred text. On the western coast of India, where the Gulf of Combat meets the Arabian Sea, lies the potential reality behind a profound legend. This is the story of Dwaraka, the celestial city described in ancient Sanskrit epics as the magnificent kingdom of Lord Krishna, said to have been built by divine command and claimed by the ocean upon his passing. For centuries, it was considered purely mythological, a spiritual metaphor rather than a physical place. Then, in the late 1980s, marine archaeologists made a series of startling discoveries just offshore from the modern town of Dwaraka. What they found were not vague shapes but distinct, massive stone structures resting on the seabed. Large rectangular blocks, some weighing several tons, were arranged in clear formations that suggested walls, pillars, and foundations. Further excavations brought up artifacts that grounded the myth in tangible history, including stone anchors, pottery shards, and bronze objects. The most evocative finds were perhaps the stone anchors themselves, identical in design to those used in the late Harappan period, a civilization contemporary with the legendary dates for Krishna's city. These are not the scattered remains of a simple fishing village, but the sunken footprint of a significant, fortified coastal settlement. The evidence for how this city met its end points toward something sudden and catastrophic. Geological studies of the region reveal a landscape prone to seismic activity. Core samples taken from the seabed near the structures show layers of sand and shell sandwiched between finer sediments, a classic signature of a high-energy marine event violently depositing material inland. This suggests Dwaraka did not slowly sink like Pavlopetri, but was likely struck by a rapid coastal inundation, perhaps a tsunami triggered by an earthquake or a massive storm surge during a period of accelerated sea level rise around 1500 BC. The timing is crucial as it coincides with a known phase of climate instability and coastal change across the Indian subcontinent. What makes Dwaraka so compelling is how it straddles two worlds. On one hand, the archaeological evidence provides a clear geological explanation, a port city devastated by a natural disaster. On the other, the ancient texts describe its submergence with poignant specificity, a city abandoned and then consumed by the sea following the departure of its divine ruler. This creates a fascinating blur between cultural memory and geological reality. It is possible that a catastrophic, real event that destroyed a major coastal center was preserved over generations, its story evolving and becoming entwined with spiritual narrative. The ruins do not prove the myth, but they give a historical anchor to it, showing that the legend likely grew from a seed of truth, a shared memory of a great city lost to the waves. Dwaraka challenges us to listen more carefully to ancient stories, not as literal records, but as potential vessels for profound historical and environmental truths, where the voice of the ocean echoes through both stone and scripture. The fate of a city is not always written in water alone, but sometimes in the very ground it stands upon. Off the coast of modern Naples, the ruins of Baia offer a different kind of lesson, one of luxury built upon a trembling foundation. This was not a vital trading port, but the ancient world's most exclusive resort, a playground for Roman emperors and senators who built magnificent villas directly over natural thermal springs. Today, the heart of this opulent city lies up to 7 meters beneath the serene waters of the bay, a sunken garden of marble and mosaic. The primary force here is a remarkable geological process called bradysism, a slow, silent breathing of the Earth's crust. In this volcanic region, vast chambers of magma and superheated water far below the surface periodically inflate and deflate, causing the overlying land to rise or fall by centimeters over years, or even meters over centuries. For Baia, the trend has been a long, slow subsidence, a gradual sinking that has allowed the sea to claim its streets. This is a powerful reminder that sea level is not an absolute measurement, but a relationship between the height of the water and the height of the land. While global ocean volumes were rising slowly in the post-Ice Age world, Baia's local land was sinking even faster due to bradysism. This combination, where local ground movement dramatically amplifies the effect of global sea level change, is known as relative sea level rise. It is the local reality that communities actually experience, a stark convergence of planetary and geological forces. The underwater ruins of Baia provide an almost uncanny snapshot of this process frozen in time. Unlike cities shattered by tsunamis, Baia's structures were submerged with a strange gentleness. Archaeologists diving there find an eerily intact world. Exquisite floor mosaics, their colorful tesserae still depicting intricate geometric patterns and marine life, lie perfectly preserved on the seafloor. Marble statues of gods and emperors stand sentinel among schools of fish, their forms now draped in soft algae rather than togas. A grand, circular dining room known as the Nymphaeum of Punta Epitafio, with its statues of Odysseus and his crew, appears as if the guests have just stepped away, the sea slowly filling the space they left behind. This incredible preservation offers more than just a glimpse of Roman luxury. It provides a precise benchmark. The depth of these ruins and the marine organisms that have colonized them allow scientists to calculate the rate of the land's subsidence with great accuracy. We see a society that was intimately aware of its dynamic environment, building their lavish baths to harness the volcanic heat, yet seemingly unable to perceive the incremental, inevitable descent of their entire world. Baia challenges our own perceptions of stability. It shows that a coast can be a place of profound beauty and leisure, yet also one of profound geological transience, where the ground itself is in quiet, constant motion. The lesson of Baia is not about a catastrophic end, but about a slow, undeniable transformation, a reminder that even the most solid-seeming foundations are part of a deeper, slower story written by the Earth itself. The slow descent of Baia stands in stark contrast to a city that vanished in minutes. On a quiet Tuesday morning in June of 1692, the most wicked city on Earth simply fell into the sea. Port Royal, Jamaica, was not an ancient metropolis but a thriving, notorious English colonial port, a hub for pirates, merchants, and naval power. Its wealth was legendary, built on sugar, slaves, and Spanish plunder. Then, at 20 minutes past 11, the ground began to shudder violently. A massive earthquake, estimated at a magnitude 7.5, struck directly beneath the town. But the true horror was not the shaking itself, but what happened next. Port Royal was built on a long, narrow sand spit, a precarious ribbon of land. The quake's force triggered a process called liquefaction in this waterlogged sand. In an instant, the solid ground turned into a churning, liquid slurry, unable to support the weight of the buildings upon it. Entire streets, brick warehouses, and taverns simply sank, some swallowed whole, others tilting and collapsing into the rising water. Over 2/3 of the city disappeared beneath Kingston Harbor in a matter of moments, claiming thousands of lives in one of the deadliest natural disasters in colonial history. While the immediate trigger was unequivocally seismic, the city's fate was sealed by its coastal geography. That fragile sand spit was a landform acutely vulnerable to the sea from the start. It was a site exposed to storm surges and hurricanes, with the water table always perilously close to the surface. This made the liquefaction during the earthquake far more catastrophic than it might have been on stable bedrock. Furthermore, studies suggest that relative sea levels in the Caribbean had been rising slowly since the end of the last ice age, gradually increasing the baseline stress on such low-lying coastal settlements. Port Royal was a disaster waiting to happen, a bustling society constructed on the worst possible foundation during an era of climatic and geological instability. The earthquake was the match, but the city's location was the tinder. This catastrophic sinking, however, created something extraordinary, an unparalleled time capsule. Because the city was engulfed so rapidly, much of it was preserved in an oxygen-poor environment, sealed under layers of sediment. Underwater archaeologists have uncovered a snapshot of 17th-century colonial life frozen at 11:20 a.m. They find pewter plates still set on tables, wine bottles unopened, a pocket watch stopped at the moment of the quake, and building timbers still standing upright. The site provides an incredibly detailed, secular record of daily life, commerce, and architecture in a pivotal Atlantic port. Yet, even this disaster-driven capsule speaks directly to coastal hazard. It is a blunt lesson in the consequences of ignoring environmental vulnerability for short-term gain. Port Royal's ruins remind us that while the pace of submergence can vary from millennia to minutes, the underlying principle remains: building on unstable, low-lying coasts in a dynamic world is an inherent gamble. The city's legacy is dual: a treasure trove for historians and a stark, sobering benchmark in the long history of human settlement facing the power of the sea. Far from the well-mapped ruins of the Mediterranean lies a mystery that defies easy classification. Off the coast of Japan's westernmost island, Yonaguni, divers encounter a breathtaking underwater landscape of monolithic terraces, sharp right-angled platforms, and what appear to be giant steps carved into the bedrock. Known as the Yonaguni Monument, this site plunges us directly into a heated scientific debate, forcing us to confront the line between nature's artistry and human hands. On one side are geologists who point to the powerful natural forces at work. The structure is composed of sandstone, a rock prone to fracturing along natural plains as it weathers. The strong currents in the area, along with seismic activity, could plausibly sculpt the dramatic, blocky forms through a process of sheeting and erosion. They argue that the seemingly perfect angles and parallel lines are a classic example of pareidolia, our human tendency to see familiar patterns like architecture in random natural shapes. For them, Yonaguni is a magnificent but entirely natural geological formation. On the other side are researchers and archaeologists who see signs of intentional design. They highlight features that seem less likely to occur without some form of modification, such as two round holes aligned next to each other that resemble column bases, or a narrow trench that looks deliberately cut. They point to what appears to be a carved relief resembling an animal or a face, and ask whether the sheer accumulation of geometric forms in one location is truly a coincidence. This camp suggests the monument could be the remnant of a ceremonial platform or a terraced structure, potentially from a prehistoric culture that was submerged as sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. This controversy is far more than an academic dispute. It serves as a masterclass in the rigorous standards required for identifying a true sunken city. Science demands more than intriguing shapes. It requires unambiguous evidence of human activity. This includes artifacts like tools or pottery, found in direct association with the structures. It requires clear signs of tool marks that cannot be explained by natural erosion, and a layout that aligns with known architectural principles of a specific culture. At Yonaguni, such definitive evidence has remained elusive. The debate powerfully illustrates how our desire to find lost civilizations can sometimes influence what we see. In the context of sea level history, the temptation is strong. A mysterious structure at a depth that matches a known period of lower sea levels seems to tell a perfect story. But rigorous climate archaeology teaches us to separate the compelling narrative from the confirmed data point. Yonaguni, regardless of its ultimate origin, stands as a profound reminder. It shows that the process of discovery is not just about finding answers, but about carefully, patiently asking the right questions and being willing to sit with the mystery until the water and the evidence becomes clear. The silent ruins beneath the waves offer different testimonies, and learning their language means distinguishing between a slow whisper and a sudden shout. Researchers face a critical puzzle at every site. Was this place claimed by the gradual, global creep of rising seas, or shattered in an instant by a local geological catastrophe? The answer lies in a meticulous forensic analysis of the ruins themselves, reading the subtle signatures left behind by each type of event. For a city lost to climate-driven sea level rise, the evidence points to a patient, relentless process. The structures themselves often remain upright and in place, simply encased by layers of fine marine sediment. Think of a staircase being slowly buried by sand on a beach, each step disappearing uniformly. Underwater, archaeologists look for this uniform submergence where an entire harbor complex, its breakwaters and docks, sits at a consistent depth as if the water table simply rose around it. The sediment layers tell a story of continuity, a slow accumulation of silt and organic matter that built up over centuries with no violent interruptions. This pattern is often regional, with multiple coastal sites along a stretch of coastline showing similar depths and states of preservation, all recording the same inexorable rise of the ocean. In stark contrast, a city struck by a sudden catastrophe like an earthquake or tsunami leaves a chaotic crime scene. The most telling clue is often structural trauma. Buildings are found tilted at severe angles, their foundations compromised by liquefaction, as seen at Port Royal. Massive stone blocks are scattered inland, carried by the force of a wave, or columns are toppled in the same direction, pointing to a single, directional surge of water. The sediment record here is dramatic and abrupt. Instead of fine, continuous layers, scientists find a thick, chaotic deposit of sand, shells, and even rubble piled atop a living surface. This is a tsunami deposit, a single, violent page in the geological diary. Below it might be the floor of a marketplace with artifacts from daily life, and above it, a completely different environment begins. Furthermore, these catastrophic sites are often isolated in their damage. One city may be completely devastated while another, just 50 miles down a protected coast, remains untouched, indicating a localized event rather than a widespread environmental shift. Volcanic activity adds another distinct signature, often involving dramatic changes in land height. A coastal area might sink rapidly due to a magma chamber emptying, as with parts of Baia, or be buried by volcanic ash before being submerged. The key for scientists is correlation. They cross-reference the local ruin with regional geological records, evidence of known fault lines, historical accounts of earthquakes, and deep sea core data that tracks global temperature and sea level. By piecing together this mosaic, they can assign a probable cause, transforming a mysterious drowned city into a specific data point. It becomes either a benchmark on the graph of planetary climate change or a tragic marker on the map of the Earth's tectonic unrest. This diagnostic work is crucial, for it tells us not just how a city fell, but what forces are most at play along our own vulnerable shores today. To truly hear the story of a sunken harbor, we must learn to read the Earth's own handwriting. When divers and archaeologists have mapped every stone, the investigation often turns to a quieter, more subtle form of evidence, one pulled not from the seafloor but from beneath it. This is the science of sediment coring, a process that allows us to extract and decode the layered history of a coastal landscape, page by ancient page. Imagine taking a giant, hollow straw and pushing it deep into the mud of a harbor basin or a nearby coastal plain. What comes back up is a core, a vertical column of sediment that can stretch back thousands of years. This column is not just dirt, it is a climate diary, a sequential record of everything that settled in that spot, season after season, century after century. Each distinct layer holds a specific clue. A band of coarse sand might tell of a powerful storm surge that swept offshore material inland. A thick, dark layer of organic rich silt could indicate a period of heavy river flooding, washing soil from the hinterlands into the harbor. Within these layers, scientists find even finer archives. Tiny, almost invisible grains of pollen from long-vanished plants reveal what was growing on the surrounding land, telling us whether the climate was wet or dry, warm or cool. Microscopic shells of marine organisms called foraminifera or forams are particularly powerful. Different species live at specific water depths and temperatures. Finding a community of shallow water forams in a layer, followed by deep water species above, provides a direct biological record of the sea growing deeper over that spot. But perhaps the most dramatic and clear-cut entry in this diary is the moment of permanent invasion, the precise transition when the sea claimed the land. This is often seen as a sharp boundary in the core. Below it, you might find a layer of terrestrial peat, the compacted remains of a freshwater marsh or swamp that once thrived on dry ground. This peat is full of land plant remains, insect parts, and perhaps even footprints of terrestrial animals. Then, abruptly, the composition changes. Above that line lies a layer of marine mud, fine and gray, filled with salt-tolerant shell fragments and those telltale marine microfossils. That boundary is not a suggestion, it is a timestamp. It marks the exact horizon where the shoreline crossed that location, where saltwater permanently replaced freshwater. By dating organic material just below and just above that line, scientists can pinpoint the century and sometimes even the decade when the sea arrived. Furthermore, the rate of sedimentation itself tells a story. A core showing thin, uniform layers suggests a long period of calm, stable conditions, but a core with several thick, chaotic sand layers packed closely together indicates an era of frequent and intense storms, a period of heightened climatic turbulence that battered the coast. By reading this layered history, we move beyond the fate of a single city. We reconstruct the entire environmental theater in which its drama played out. We see not just the moment the harbor drowned, but the changing weather patterns, river behaviors, and ecological shifts that led to that moment. The silent mud holds a narrative more detailed than any stone inscription, chronicling the slow, patient pressure of a changing world upon the vulnerable edge of human settlement. A single city is a powerful data point, but to understand a civilization's fate, we must zoom out to the landscape itself. The true scale of environmental change is often written not in the ruins of a port, but in the vanished geography that once supported it. Think of a river delta not as a static line on a map, but as a living, breathing interface where land and water are in constant negotiation. When the sea rises, it is these low-lying, fertile deltas that are the first territories to be surrendered, their intricate networks of channels and islands slowly erased from the world. The submerged cities we find are often just the most prominent landmarks in a much larger, drowned country. To grasp the full story, we must search for forgotten river mouths and shifted coastlines, the lost foundations of entire ways of life. Consider the mighty Nile which we encountered with Thonis-Heracleion. That sunken port was not an isolated tragedy. but one symptom of a transformed delta. Today, we see the Nile fanning out into the Mediterranean in a familiar, roughly triangular shape, but geological and archaeological evidence reveals a different past. Researchers have identified several ancient, now submerged branches of the Nile river mouths that once carried fresh water and silt far beyond the current coastline. These were not minor streams, but major distributaries that defined the delta's shape for millennia. Core samples taken offshore show thick layers of Nile sediment extending kilometers out to sea, proving that what is now the seabed was once dry, fertile land crisscrossed by these waterways. The slow rise of the Mediterranean over the last several thousand years did not just flood a city, it drowned an entire landscape. It swallowed the marshes, the farmlands, and the smaller settlements that depended on those lost river branches. This had profound human consequences. As certain delta regions became waterlogged and saline, their agricultural productivity would have declined. Populations living along those fading branches would have been forced to retreat inland, consolidating around the remaining viable channels. This environmental pressure likely reshaped political power, trade routes, and settlement patterns across ancient Egypt, all driven by the creeping advance of the sea. This pattern repeats across the world. On the other side of Asia, the story of the Indus River civilization, also known as the Harappan culture, is deeply intertwined with a shifting coastline. This was one of the world's great early urban societies, with planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. For a long time, a major mystery surrounded its eventual decline. While factors like changing monsoon patterns played a role, the movement of the river itself and the sea level were critical actors. Geological studies indicate that the mouth of the Indus River was not always where it is today. During the Harappan zenith, the main river channel and its delta likely lay much further east. Over centuries, the river naturally shifted its course due to siltation, a common process in deltaic systems. But this natural wandering was compounded by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. As the Arabian Sea encroached, it would have flooded the lower reaches of the delta, making the land swampy and less suitable for the large-scale agriculture that supported the cities. The combination of a migrating river and a rising sea could have severed trade links, disrupted freshwater supplies, and rendered entire districts uninhabitable. The great cities did not necessarily sink beneath the waves, but the supportive coastal plain that connected them to the wider world was fundamentally altered, contributing to their fragmentation and eventual abandonment. This broader perspective changes how we interpret a single sunken city. It moves us from a story about a place that drowned to a story about a world that receded. A harbor did not fail in isolation. It was the last node in a network that the sea was systematically dismantling. The evidence for these lost landscapes is gathered not only from underwater ruins, but from the subtle contours of the modern seafloor, from sediment cores that show the transition from river mud to marine silt, and from satellite imagery that can detect the ghostly outlines of old channels beneath shallow waters. These forgotten coasts tell us that climate shifts do not just threaten structures, they erase geographies. They redraw the very maps that civilizations are built upon, forcing societies into retreat, adaptation, or collapse. When we look at our own modern deltas, from the Mississippi to the Ganges, we are not looking at permanent fixtures. We are looking at the current, temporary front line in an ancient war between land and water, a front line that has moved countless times before. The silent, submerged plains beyond our shores hold the blueprints of lost worlds, reminding us that the ground beneath our feet is part of a much slower and far more powerful conversation. The sea is not a simple, rising bathtub. Its relationship with the land is a complex and dynamic dance, where the floor itself can move. To truly understand why one harbor drowns while another remains high and dry, we must introduce two powerful geological forces that act independently of the ocean's volume, isostasy and tectonics. These forces mean that the story of a sunken city is never just about water. It is always a local equation, a calculation where the motion of the land is as crucial as the height of the sea. Let us start with isostasy, a concept of balance. Imagine the Earth's crust floating on a denser, more fluid mantle below, much like a heavy ship sits in water. During an ice age, colossal glaciers, sometimes miles thick, press down on continents like a giant's hand. This immense weight causes the land beneath to sink slightly into the mantle. Then, when the climate warms and the ice melts away, that weight is removed. The land, now unburdened, begins to slowly rebound, rising back up over thousands of years. This is post-glacial rebound, and its effects are dramatic. In regions like Scandinavia and Canada, which were under the heaviest ice sheets, the land is still rising today. Here, the story of ancient coastal settlements is flipped. Instead of finding drowned ports, archaeologists discover harbors that are now stranded far inland, raised high above the modern shoreline. Viking age boat moorings and fishing villages in Sweden and Norway can be found dozens of meters above the current sea level, clear evidence that the land has risen faster than the global ocean. In these places, the relative sea level has actually fallen. Now, contrast this with the Mediterranean. Many of its coasts are not rebounding, they are subsiding or sinking. This is often due to tectonic activity, the immense, slow-motion collision of the Earth's plates. As these plates grind against one another, some blocks of crust are pushed up to form mountains, while adjacent blocks are pulled down, creating basins. The Nile Delta, where Thonis-Heracleion lies, is one such sinking basin, slowly compacting under the weight of its own sediment. The Italian coast near Baia is another, descending due to volcanic bradysism. In these regions, the land itself is sinking, which dramatically amplifies the effect of global sea level rise. The local, relative sea level climbs much faster than the global average. This explains why the Mediterranean holds such a rich collection of sunken cities. It is a region where both forces, rising water and sinking ground, are often working in the same devastating direction. This crucial distinction teaches us a vital lesson. A single graph of global sea level cannot tell you the fate of a specific coastline. You must always ask, what is the land doing here? Is it rising, holding the sea at bay, or is it sinking, inviting the water inland? The ruins of a sunken harbor are therefore a precise local instrument. They record the net result of these combined motions at that exact point on the globe. A city submerged off Greece tells a different story than a raised Viking port in Sweden, not because the oceans behaved differently, but because the land beneath them did. When we look at our own world's vulnerable coasts today, from Louisiana to Bangladesh, we are seeing this same equation in action. The future shoreline will be shaped not only by the volume of water in the oceans, but by whether the ground beneath our feet is holding steady, rising, or quietly giving way. This complex equation of land and sea provides the backdrop for one of history's greatest mysteries. Around 1200 BCE, the vibrant, interconnected world of the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age began to unravel. The grand palaces of the Mycenaean Greeks burned, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia dissolved into fragments, trade routes linking Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant faltered and went silent. Historians call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, a twilight of civilizations. For a long time, the explanations focused on human factors, invasions by mysterious sea peoples, internal rebellions, and systemic economic failure. But the silent testimony of the coastline suggests another powerful actor was also at work, a period of profound and rapid climatic instability that would have pulled the very foundation from under these maritime societies. Evidence gathered from ice cores, tree rings, and lake sediments across the region paints a picture of a world suddenly out of balance. This was not a single event, but a multi-decade climate crisis. Data indicates a significant shift toward cooler, drier conditions. Persistent droughts would have strained agricultural yields, the very engine that fed the cities and supported the armies of these kingdoms. But for civilizations built on sea power and trade, the changes along the coast would have been even more directly catastrophic. This period of cooling and atmospheric change is also linked to a significant increase in storminess and unpredictable weather patterns in the Mediterranean. The sea, their highway, would have become a more dangerous and unreliable partner. We can see the impact of this instability etched into the archaeological record of the coasts. While few major ports from this era are fully submerged, many show clear signs of abrupt distress and abandonment coinciding with this turbulent period. Settlements were often relocated to higher ground, away from the vulnerable shoreline. Harbors show layers of silt and storm debris that were never properly cleared, suggesting a loss of resources or will to maintain them. The maritime network was a delicate web of trust and logistics. A king in Mycenae relied on timely shipments of copper from Cyprus to arm his soldiers, and on grain from the Levant to feed his people. This system required safe, predictable voyages. Increased storm frequency and intensity would have made those voyages riskier, sinking more ships and driving up the cost of insurance and goods. Simultaneously, the fluctuating sea levels of the time, a product of this broader climatic shift, would have presented a more insidious problem. A harbor entrance that slowly silted up or became too shallow for deep draft vessels could strangle a city's economic life without a single enemy in sight. Imagine the strain on a port city like Ugarit, a vital trade hub on the coast of modern Syria. Letters from its final days speak of desperation, pleading for grain shipments and warning of enemies. Now layer onto that political and social stress the physical reality of a changing coast. If drought reduced the freshwater supply even as rising salinity from storm surges contaminated wells, the city's habitability would crumble. If the docks required constant, expensive repair due to storm damage that the royal treasury could no longer afford, trade would wither. The climate crisis did not invent the sea peoples or cause palace revolts. But it created the conditions in which those human factors became catastrophic. It stretched the resilience of these complex societies to a breaking point by attacking their fundamental pillars: food security and the trade networks that distributed wealth and resources. The collapse was not a uniform event, and neither was the environmental pressure. Some regions fared better than others. Egypt, with its resilient Nile-based agriculture, weathered the storm though weakened. But for the palatial economies of the Aegean and Anatolia, the combination of drought, famine, social unrest, and a disrupted maritime lifeline proved overwhelming. The ruins and abandoned settlements along 1200 BC coastlines are not just evidence of invasion, they are markers of a great retreat from the sea. They tell us that when the climate shifts rapidly, it does not merely change the weather, it can unravel the very networks of exchange and cooperation that hold a civilization together. The Bronze Age world did not drown in a single flood, but it may have slowly starved and fractured as its connection to the sea, its source of life and wealth, grew treacherous and unreliable. Centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, the climate pendulum swung again, this time toward warmth. Between roughly 950 and 1250 AD, a climatic anomaly known as the medieval warm period created a temporary but powerful shift across the North Atlantic. Average temperatures in Europe and the Arctic rose, glaciers retreated, and the sea ice that typically choked northern waters began to loosen its grip. This was not a global phenomenon in the modern sense, but its regional effects were profound, especially for a people whose entire world was the sea. For the Norse Vikings, this era of milder conditions opened a highway across the top of the world. The reduction in sea ice created longer, more reliable sailing seasons and exposed new routes. It was during this window of opportunity that legendary explorers like Eric the Red sailed west, discovering and settling two formidable frontiers, Iceland and later Greenland. These were not mere outposts but thriving communities that represented the farthest reach of European settlement at the time. The warmer climate was their silent partner. In Greenland, the name itself was a piece of clever marketing, but it also reflected a temporary reality. The slightly longer growing seasons and reduced ice along the fjords allowed the Norse to establish their eastern and western settlements, where they built stone churches, raised livestock, and even exported walrus ivory and hide back to Europe. The sea, now more navigable, was their lifeline, connecting these remote colonies to a trade network that stretched all the way to Constantinople. Yet this era of expansion was built on a climate that was inherently temporary. The very conditions that enabled their settlement also began to subtly reshape their world in another way. Warmer global temperatures meant melting land ice, which contributed to a gradual rise in sea levels. This rise was slow, perhaps only a few centimeters per century, but over the lifespan of a colony, its effects compounded. For ports and coastal farms, even a small increase in sea level could mean more frequent flooding during storms, the gradual salinization of freshwater sources near the shore, and the erosion of valuable land. The Norse were masterful sailors and resilient settlers, but their entire economic and social structure in Greenland was precariously balanced on specific environmental conditions. Then the climate pendulum began its slow swing back. Starting in the 13th century, the Northern Hemisphere entered a period of cooling now called the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped, glaciers in the mountains advanced once more, and the sea ice returned with a vengeance. This presented a dual crisis for the Greenland settlements. On land, the growing seasons shortened dramatically, making it increasingly difficult to sustain hay crops to feed livestock through the long winters. But the change at sea was even more catastrophic. The expansion of pack ice made the vital shipping routes to Iceland and Europe far more dangerous and unpredictable. Voyages that were once routine became gambles with the ice, and the lifeline of trade and communication began to fray. The rising sea levels of the earlier warm period did not reverse with the cooling. Instead, they may have combined with increased storminess to make coastal areas even more vulnerable. Archaeological evidence from the last known Norse sites in Greenland tells a story of a society under mounting pressure. Analysis of garbage heaps, called middens, shows a dietary shift from domesticated animals to more marine resources, a sign of agricultural hardship. The last written record from the Western settlement is a stark account of a wedding in 1408, after which the community vanishes from history. The prevailing theory is not one of a single disaster but of a slow stranglehold. As the climate grew colder and the ice closed in, the settlements became isolated, their economy collapsed, and the people likely faced a terrible choice: adapt in ways that left no trace or depart in small, unrecorded groups. Their abandoned stone houses, now standing silent on the edges of Greenland's fjords, are monuments to a different kind of climate story. They represent not a city submerged by water, but a civilization isolated and ultimately extinguished by the return of the ice. A poignant reminder that a changing climate can both giveth and taketh away, reshaping human destiny by opening doors to new worlds and then, centuries later, quietly closing them. The story of the Norse is a stark reminder that cooling does not always mean safety from the sea. The period we call the Little Ice Age, stretching from the 14th to the 19th centuries, presents a profound climatic paradox. While glaciers advanced and average temperatures across Europe and North America dropped, many coastlines faced not a retreating ocean, but an increasingly aggressive one. Historical records from this era are filled with accounts of devastating storms and catastrophic floods, events that left permanent scars on the landscape and in the collective memory of coastal communities. To understand why a cooler planet could batter its shores with such fury, we must look beyond simple temperature and into the complex machinery of the ocean itself. Global cooling shifts atmospheric pressure patterns and alters the paths of major ocean currents. One key factor during the Little Ice Age was a southward shift in the North Atlantic storm track. This meant that powerful, low-pressure systems that might have spent their energy over the open ocean were now steered directly into the coasts of Western Europe with greater frequency and intensity. Furthermore, changes in ocean circulation can cause water to pile up against certain coastlines. Even as glacial ice was growing on land in some regions, the dynamical effect of changing currents and winds led to a regional rise in sea level in the North Sea and parts of the Baltic. This created a dangerous formula: higher background water levels combined with more frequent and severe storms. The result was an era of unprecedented coastal inundation. We see this vividly in the historical chronicles of the Netherlands and England. The Great Drowning of Men, a series of catastrophic storm surges that hit the North Sea coast in the 13th and 14th centuries, reclaimed vast tracts of land and resulted in the loss of many thousands of lives. Entire villages vanished beneath the waves, their names preserved only in records of the lost. In England, the chronicler William of Malmesbury described the terrible flood of 1099 that swept away entire villages and drowned crops. Centuries later, the Great Storm of 1703, immortalized by writer Daniel Defoe, pushed the Thames over its banks and caused widespread destruction, an event scientists now link to the extreme weather patterns of the Little Ice Age. The physical evidence for this turbulent period is still being uncovered. Along the coast of Wales, archaeologists have studied the remains of a medieval village known as Cenfig, now largely buried under sand dunes. Historical documents state it was abandoned after being overwhelmed by shifting sands driven by violent storms in the 14th century. In the German North Sea, the ruins of the legendary trading port of Rungholt, often called the Atlantis of the North Sea, lie submerged in the Wadden Sea. According to folk tales and historical sources, it was destroyed during a massive storm surge in 1362, an event so traumatic it etched itself into regional folklore. These are not myths of a golden age, but cultural memories of real environmental disasters. The ruins of these flooded settlements, whether buried under sand or silt, serve as tangible benchmarks. They mark moments when the delicate balance between land and sea was violently overturned, not by a warming world, but by a cooler, more turbulent one. This paradox forces us to expand our understanding of climate threat. It is not merely about the slow creep of rising water, but about the increasing energy and unpredictability of the system itself. A changing climate, whether warming or cooling, redistributes energy across the planet, and coastlines have always borne the brunt of that rearrangement. The lesson from the Little Ice Age is clear. The greatest danger often lies not in the gradual trend, but in the sharpening of nature's weapons, the storms and surges that test the resilience of human settlements at the water's edge. The violent storms of the Little Ice Age offer a sobering preview of our own era's coastal vulnerability. Today, the ancient patterns we have traced are not just history, they are unfolding in real time in cities we know by name. Venice, the floating city of canals, is quite literally sinking into its lagoon, a victim of both the slow compaction of its foundational sediments and the global rise of the Adriatic Sea. Jakarta, the massive capital of Indonesia, is subsiding at an alarming rate, with some northern districts dropping by several centimeters each year, a crisis driven heavily by the unchecked extraction of groundwater from the aquifer below. And Miami, built upon porous limestone, faces a double threat from rising seas and the saltwater intrusion that follows, compromising its freshwater supply with every high tide. These are not future predictions, they are present-day realities, and they mirror the ancient stories with an eerie precision. Just like Thonis-Heracleion sank into the soft Nile delta, these modern metropolises are built on geologically young, unstable ground. The same forces are at work, the subsidence of the land meeting the rising height of the ocean. Yet there is a critical, accelerating difference. In the ancient world, the primary drivers were natural, the lingering rise from glacial melt, the slow breathing of tectonic plates. Today, human action has become a dominant geological force. Our burning of fossil fuels is supercharging global warming, causing seawater to expand and land ice to melt at an unprecedented pace, accelerating the sea level rise side of the equation. Simultaneously, our own engineering choices are accelerating the subsidence side. In cities like Jakarta, pumping vast quantities of groundwater for millions of residents causes the soil layers to compact and collapse like a squeezed sponge, dramatically speeding up the sinking process. We are, in effect, replicating the fatal combination that drowned ancient ports, but we are doing it with a conscious hand and at a vastly quicker tempo. The parallel is clear. We are constructing our own modern versions of sunken cities, but with one profound advantage: our ancient counterparts lacked precise knowledge. We have satellites that measure millimeter changes in land height, tide gauges that track sea level rise to the fraction of an inch, and climate models that project future scenarios. We can see the entire equation, land motion plus water rise, with stunning clarity. This transforms the story from a fascinating archaeological mystery into an urgent contemporary choice. The ruins we study were once vibrant communities that adapted until they could not. Their silent stones ask us a direct question, armed with the data they never had. What will we choose to build, to preserve, or to change before the water writes the next chapter for us? Knowledge alone is not enough. The true test is what we build with it. Throughout history, coastal civilizations have not been passive victims of the sea. They have been perpetual engineers, locked in a contest of ingenuity against an unyielding force. The ruins we find are often the sites of their final defeat, but they also hold the blueprints of their resistance, the physical evidence of adaptation. In ancient Mesopotamia, the great port city of situated near the shifting mouths of the Euphrates, did not build directly on the unstable delta mud. Instead, its architects constructed massive platforms of layered reed mats and bitumen, raising the foundations of temples and warehouses above the floodplain. This was not a permanent solution, but it was a calculated response, buying centuries of stability against seasonal floods and gradual water table rise. The Romans, masters of hydraulic engineering, approached the problem from the seaward side. At ports like Caesarea Maritima, they constructed colossal breakwaters or moles from innovative concrete that could cure underwater. These artificial arms reached out to embrace and calm the open sea, creating safe harbors where none existed naturally. They were fighting the waves themselves, attempting to define a permanent, calm boundary in a dynamic system. These ancient efforts share a common thread. They were defensive and localized, designed to protect a specific city or harbor from the immediate symptoms of a changing coast. They treated the sea as an adversary to be held at bay, a force to be managed within the limits of contemporary technology and understanding. Our modern toolbox is immeasurably more powerful, yet the philosophical challenge remains strikingly similar. Today's coastal engineers also build barriers, but on a colossal scale. The massive seawalls of cities like Rotterdam or the storm surge barriers of Venice, like the Moat system, are the direct descendants of the Roman mole, just amplified by steel, concrete, and computer modeling. We engage in land reclamation on a staggering level, as seen in places like Singapore or the Palm Islands of Dubai, literally pulling new territory from the sea. This is the ultimate expression of the old mindset, not just holding the line but aggressively pushing it outward. Yet we are also developing a more nuanced and perhaps more humble strategy known as managed retreat. This involves deliberately relocating infrastructure and communities away from the most vulnerable shorelines, restoring coastal wetlands as natural buffers, and designing buildings to be resilient or even amphibious. It is an acknowledgement that sometimes the most intelligent engineering is strategic withdrawal, working with natural processes rather than against them in a futile struggle. This raises the pivotal question at the heart of our current moment: can our modern engineering, for all its might, ultimately outpace the rates of environmental change recorded in the geological past? The sunken cities we study are cautionary benchmarks. They show us that past civilizations often succeeded for generations, even centuries, with their adaptations, until they encountered a tipping point where the scale or speed of change exceeded their capacity to respond. The critical difference today is the rate. The post-ice age sea level rise that drowned Pavlopetri occurred over millennia, allowing for gradual cultural adaptation or migration. The subsidence and sea level rise threatening modern megacities is occurring over decades. Our engineering is spectacular, but it is being tested in a race against a clock set by our own actions. The ancient ruins ask us to consider not just if we can build a higher wall, but whether we can innovate faster than the ocean rises, and whether our greatest ingenuity might lie in knowing when to build, when to adapt, and when to gracefully let the old shoreline go. The silent stones of a sunken city hold more than just architectural plans. They capture the final moments of a society's economic heartbeat. When archaeologists examine these sites, they are not just mapping streets, they are reading the social and economic fingerprint left behind by the crisis itself, a record written in what was taken, what was left, and how the space was ultimately abandoned. This evidence reveals whether a community had time for an orderly retreat or was forced into a frantic escape. One of the most telling signs is the state of the buildings themselves. In some ruins, researchers find clear evidence of deliberate demolition. Large structures show systematic removal of valuable materials like timber roof beams, cut stone blocks, or metal fixtures. This is not the random collapse of time, but a careful salvage operation. It speaks of a planned departure where a community, facing the inevitable advance of the water, made the difficult decision to strip their own city of its reusable wealth to rebuild elsewhere. The process is slow and logistical, implying a measured response to a gradual threat. In stark contrast, other sites tell a story of sudden flight. Here, the artifacts paint a picture of daily life interrupted. A marketplace might be found with weights and scales still in place, as if the merchant simply stepped away. Homes can contain personal items, jewelry, or tools left behind, items too valuable to abandon in a planned move. This scatter of everyday objects points to a crisis that allowed no time for packing, perhaps a catastrophic storm surge or a rapid, earthquake-triggered subsidence that forced an immediate evacuation. The true societal impact, however, extends far beyond the city walls. A primary harbor was not just a place, it was the vital organ of a regional economic body. Its loss could cause systemic failure. We see this clearly in the transition from Thonis-Heracleion to Alexandria. For centuries, Thonis-Heracleion thrived as the mandatory customs gate for Egypt, a choke point where taxes were collected and trade was controlled. Its wealth and power were directly tied to this function. Yet, as the land subsided and the waters rose, making the harbor increasingly difficult to navigate and maintain, its economic rationale eroded. Meanwhile, Alexander the Great founded Alexandria on a more stable stretch of coast nearby. As Thonis-Heracleion struggled against its environmental trap, Alexandria's modern infrastructure and deeper, more accessible harbors offered a superior alternative. The economic energy, the merchants, the shipping lanes all gradually shifted. Thonis-Heracleion did not just sink physically, it was made obsolete. Its submergence was the final act in a longer economic decline, as the lifeblood of commerce was deliberately redirected to a new, more viable heart. This kind of transition reshapes entire regions. The communities that supplied the port with goods, the farmers who fed its population, the artisans who repaired its ships, all would have faced dwindling opportunities. A network of interdependence unravels, leading to population migration, the decline of supporting towns, and a reconfiguration of political power. The ruins of the harbor, therefore, are just the epicenter. The social and economic aftershocks radiate outward, leaving a much broader, though less visible, archaeological signature of change in the hinterlands. The choice to leave a city is never just about water. It is a complex calculus of survival, economics, and the painful severing of deep roots to seek a future elsewhere. Stone and sediment tell one part of the story, but the most intimate details are often recorded by life itself. Within the quiet ruins of a sunken harbor, scientists find biological time capsules, organisms whose very existence maps the ancient environment with stunning precision. These are not mere decorations on the stones, they are precise instruments, nature's own recorders of depth, temperature, and salinity from centuries past. Among the most powerful of these proxies are coral colonies. When divers discover a fossilized coral head clinging to the base of a submerged Roman column or a Mycenaean wall, they have found more than an interesting growth. They have uncovered a living depth gauge from a specific moment in history. Corals are famously picky architects. Most reef-building species can only thrive within a narrow, sunlit zone of clear, warm water, typically less than 10 meters deep. Finding a large, ancient coral colony established on a man-made structure tells researchers the exact depth of the sea at the time that coral was alive. By dating the coral itself using methods like uranium series dating, they can pinpoint not only how deep the water was, but also when that specific depth was reached. Furthermore, the chemistry locked within the coral's skeleton acts as a historical thermometer. As coral polyps build their calcium carbonate homes, they incorporate trace elements from the surrounding seawater. The ratio of certain elements, like strontium to calcium, varies subtly with the water temperature. By analyzing microscopic samples from along the coral's growth bands, much like reading tree rings, scientists can reconstruct the seasonal sea temperatures that the coral experienced centuries or even millennia ago. A coral growing on a sunken breakwater can thus reveal if the harbor drowned during a period of unusual warmth or relative cool, adding a critical layer of climate context to the architectural ruin it adorns. Equally telling are the remains of coastal forests that once stood guard on dry land. In the soft sediments near many submerged cities, researchers often discover a dark, fibrous layer quite different from the surrounding silt or sand. This is peat, the compacted remains of ancient mangrove swamps or freshwater marshes. Mangroves are the sentinels of the tropical and subtropical coastline, their tangled roots thriving in the brackish zone where land meets sea. They cannot survive permanent submersion. Finding a thick bed of mangrove peat beneath the open waters of a bay, or sandwiched between marine mud layers in a core sample, is a definitive environmental signature. It marks the precise location of a past shoreline, a lush, living ecosystem that was ultimately killed by the advancing ocean. The transition is stark in the sediment record. Below the peat, you might find soil with land snail shells and root traces. Then comes the dense, organic peat itself, filled with preserved mangrove roots, leaves, and pollen. Above it lies marine mud, silent and gray. That boundary is the moment of drowning, the exact time when saltwater permanently invaded the forest floor. By dating the youngest material in the peat, scientists can establish the last moment the mangroves were alive, providing a remarkably accurate timestamp for when the sea crossed that particular point on the landscape. These biological archives offer a humbling perspective. They remind us that the ruins we study were not isolated monuments, but parts of a vibrant, interconnected living world. A thriving port was always accompanied by a fringe of protective mangroves, filtering the water and buffering the shore from storms. The death of that forest, recorded in the peat, was often the first act in the harbor's own slow demise, a silent, biological warning that the balance between land and water had fundamentally shifted. The most telling clues at a disaster site are often the things that are not there. In a city claimed by gradual sea level rise, the archaeological record tells a story of managed decline. We find evidence of adaptation, like streets being repaved at higher levels or buildings being retrofitted with raised foundations. There are signs of organized salvage, where valuable materials like metal fittings, timber, and cut stone were carefully removed for reuse elsewhere. The abandonment is layered and logical, a community making difficult, sequential choices as the water's advance became undeniable. This creates a rich, if somber, material culture of transition. Now contrast this with the chilling signature of a catastrophic sink like Port Royal. Here, the scene is one of interrupted life, a snapshot frozen at the instant of calamity. The value lies in its horrifying completeness, but this very completeness creates a profound silence in the record. What is missing are the signs of any planning or response. There is no evidence of systematic salvage because there was no time. No one returned to carefully retrieve the silver from the tavern or the tools from the workshop. The artifacts we find are those that were in active use at 11:20 a.m. on that Tuesday morning, not those chosen for a future elsewhere. This absence of preparatory action is itself a deafening form of evidence. It tells archaeologists the disaster was not a slow pressure but a sudden, overwhelming cut. The material culture is not about leaving, it is about being stopped. A skeleton key rests in a lock, a pipe sits beside a chair. These are not abandoned possessions, they are momentarily set-aside items, their owners expecting to return in a moment that never came. This creates a different kind of historical truth. A gradually abandoned site reveals a society's strategy, its priorities in the face of a long crisis. A catastrophically submerged site reveals its daily rhythm, its mundane reality, instantly fossilized. The silence of the sudden drop is the silence of contingency erased, of all future possibilities for that place collapsing into a single, definitive past. It shows us a community not in retreat, but in mid-stride, forever captured at the precipice between normalcy and oblivion. The search for these lost worlds has been transformed from a story of chance discovery to one of precise scientific inquiry. Where ancient divers once felt for stones in the murk, we now send sound and light to map the unseen. The tools of modern archaeology have opened a new chapter, allowing us to systematically scan the continental shelves, the drowned edges of continents, and read their submerged histories like an open book. Among the most vital instruments in this quest is sonar, specifically a technology called side-scan sonar. Imagine towing a sleek, torpedo-like device called a towfish behind a research vessel. This device emits fan-shaped pulses of sound energy down toward the seafloor. When these sound waves strike an object or a texture change, they bounce back. The strength and timing of these echoes are processed to create a detailed, almost photographic image of the seabed. Unlike a camera, it works in total darkness and can cut through murky water. On the sonar record, a smooth, muddy plane appears as a uniform gray, but a line of stones, a shipwreck, or the geometric outline of a foundation wall scatters the sound differently, appearing as a sharp, bright signature against the dark. This allows researchers to cover large swaths of ocean floor efficiently, identifying anomalies that warrant a closer look from human divers or remote-operated vehicles. For an even more comprehensive view, scientists employ multibeam bathymetry. This is sonar in 3 dimensions. Instead of a single fan of sound, a multibeam system mounted on a ship's hull emits a wide swath of precise sound beams that measure the depth of the seafloor directly below and out to the sides. By combining millions of these individual depth measurements, a computer constructs a stunningly accurate, high-resolution topographic map of the underwater landscape. Suddenly, we are not just seeing shapes on a flat plane, we are seeing the full terrain. A multi-beam map can reveal the subtle curve of a submerged river channel cutting across the shelf, the circular depression of a sinkhole that might have been a freshwater spring, or the unmistakable, linear ridges of collapsed walls and roads. It turns the seafloor into a readable relief map, showing where a city might logically have been built on a sheltered rise near a now-drowned river mouth. Perhaps the most revolutionary tool, however, works from space. Satellite-derived bathymetry uses sophisticated sensors to measure the color and intensity of light reflected from the ocean. Clear, shallow water allows sunlight to reach the seabed and reflect back, while deeper water absorbs more light. By analyzing these subtle differences in hue and brightness, algorithms can estimate depth in coastal zones, penetrating waters up to 30 meters deep in ideal conditions. The true power of this technology is its scale and accessibility. Researchers can survey thousands of square kilometers of coastal shelf from their desks, identifying large-scale features that are invisible from sea level. They can spot the ghostly, meandering paths of ancient rivers on the continental shelf, tracing where the Nile, the Indus, or the Mississippi once flowed across land that is now underwater. They can identify broad, sheltered bays that would have made perfect natural harbors 10,000 years ago. These tools do not replace the diver or the excavator, they guide them. They turn the needle in a haystack search into a targeted investigation. By first mapping the drowned paleo landscape, the ancient geography, archaeologists can make educated predictions about where human settlements would have been most advantageous. They can ask the landscape itself, where would you build a port? The answer, written in the contours of the seafloor and the spectral data from satellites, points the way to our next discovery, transforming the vast, blue unknown into a field of clues waiting to be deciphered. These individual sunken cities were not isolated islands in the ancient sea. They were the final hilltops, the last surviving promontories of a much vaster and now vanished country. To truly grasp the scale of what was lost, we must expand our vision beyond the harbor walls and out onto the continental shelves. Today, these underwater plains slope gently away from our coasts before plunging into the deep ocean abyss. But for most of human history, they were not submerged at all. During the last ice age, when so much of the planet's water was locked up in colossal glaciers, global sea levels were over 100 meters lower than they are now. What we call the continental shelf was for tens of thousands of years dry and exposed land. It was the true coastal plain, a sprawling, habitable frontier that connected continents and cradled early human societies. This changes the entire map of our prehistoric world. The English Channel was not a barrier but a wide, fertile river valley. The North Sea was an immense lowland, a region archaeologists have named Doggerland. Stretching from the east coast of Britain to the coasts of the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, Doggerland was a landscape of rolling hills, forests, rivers, and marshes. It was populated by animals like mammoths and aurochs, and crucially by human hunter-gatherers who followed the herds and exploited its rich resources. Their stone tools and the bones of their prey are still dredged up by fishing trawlers in the North Sea today, silent proof of a world that is now fathoms deep. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf connected the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Borneo into a continuous landmass almost the size of Europe, known as Sunderland. This was not a marginal swamp, but a core region for human migration and development. When we discover a sunken harbor from 5,000 years ago, like Pavlopetri, we are not finding a city that was built at the water's edge of its time. We are finding a settlement that was constructed well inland, within a broad coastal plain that has since completely disappeared beneath the waves. The city's harbor was likely connected to the open sea by a river that flowed across this now drowned plain. Its submergence is not just the loss of a port, but the final chapter in the drowning of an entire continent's worth of territory. These lost landscapes force a staggering realization. The majority of places where early coastal humans lived, hunted, fished, and first experimented with settlement are not on our current maps. They are underwater, buried under layers of marine sediment on the continental shelves. Every ancient harbor we find is merely the highest, most durable point of a much larger story, the last architectural remnant of a country that slowly sank from view over millennia. This transforms our understanding of human migration and cultural exchange. The journeys we imagine as perilous sea crossings might have been, for a time, much simpler overland treks or short hops across narrow straits. The isolation we assume for island cultures is a very recent condition in the long story of human habitation. The rising seas at the end of the Ice Age did more than flood coastlines. They fundamentally rewrote human geography, cutting off land bridges, creating new islands, and forcing populations into retreat and consolidation. The ruins of a single city, therefore, are like finding the steeple of a cathedral poking above a flood. It is a clue that beneath the calm surface of the sea lies the forgotten foundation of our world, a lost landscape where the first chapters of our coastal story were truly written. These drowned landscapes provide the raw data, but to see the full picture we must step inside the simulation. The precise depth and age of a sunken harbor, once established, become far more than isolated facts. They transform into what scientists call a control point, a fixed star in the uncertain sky of Earth's past climate. Imagine trying to reconstruct the plot of a novel when most of its pages are missing. A few surviving sentences, if they contain key details like a character's age on a specific date, allow you to infer the timeline of the entire story. A sunken city functions in exactly this way for climate modelers. When a computer runs a simulation of post-ice age sea level rise, it calculates a complex interplay of factors: the melting of glaciers over Greenland and Antarctica, the thermal expansion of warming ocean water, and the slow rebound of the land itself. The model produces a predicted curve, a line on a graph showing how high the sea should have been at any given location over thousands of years. But is that curve correct? This is where the silent testimony of a place like Pavlopetri becomes essential. Archaeologists and geologists provide a hard data point, stating with confidence that this specific harbor was functional and at sea level 5,200 years ago and now rests 8 meters underwater. The model's prediction for that exact location and time must pass directly through that point. If the simulated sea level curve misses the mark, if it shows the harbor should have been dry when it was wet or submerged earlier than it was, then the model's internal physics need adjustment. Perhaps it underestimated how quickly a certain ice sheet melted, or overestimated the rate of land subsidence in that region. Each validated sunken city acts as a benchmark, a reality check that forces the digital simulation to conform to the physical evidence. This process of calibration is continuous and global. A point from a drowned port in Greece is cross-referenced with data from a raised beach in Scandinavia and a coral core from the Pacific. Together, this network of archaeological and geological control points weaves a tapestry of verified change, pinning the fluid models of theory to the solid anchors of history. In this way, the stones of a forgotten harbor do not just tell us about the past, they actively improve our vision of the future. The same physical laws that govern the melting of ancient ice sheets govern the melting we observe today. By rigorously testing our models against the proven outcomes of the past, we increase our confidence in their predictions for the centuries ahead. The depth of a Mycenaean quayside becomes a critical input for forecasting the fate of Miami or Mumbai. This transforms underwater archaeology from a purely historical pursuit into a foundational climate science. Every carefully dated ruin adds a crucial piece to the puzzle, helping to answer the most pressing question, not just how high will the seas rise, but how fast. The past, locked in those submerged stones, holds the key to calibrating our window on the future. But this race to understand the past is set against a ticking clock. The very forces that revealed these cities, the rising and shifting seas, are now accelerating their destruction. Underwater archaeology exists in a fragile space between urgent discovery and respectful preservation, a discipline forced to make difficult choices as the waves close in. The primary threat is no longer just time, but an increase in the ocean's energy. More frequent and intense storms driven by our warming climate scour the seabed with powerful currents. These storms can shift sediments that have protected delicate artifacts for millennia, exposing wooden hulls, fragile pottery, and human-made structures to swift degradation and biological decay. A site that lay preserved in stable, low-oxygen mud for centuries can be stripped bare in a single hurricane season, its historical information scattered and lost forever. Alongside this natural erosion comes a human threat, the rampant looting of submerged sites. Ancient shipwrecks and sunken cities are often seen as treasure troves, not as priceless archives. Using scuba gear and cheap technology, looters can strip a site of its most valuable artifacts, coins, jewelry, and statues, selling them on the black market. This theft is a double loss. It robs nations of their cultural heritage and, more critically, destroys the context. An amphora pulled from the mud and sold privately tells us nothing about the ship that carried it, its trade route, or its final voyage. The true story dies when the artifact is ripped from its resting place. Further pressure comes from coastal and offshore development. The construction of ports, pipelines, wind farms, and beach renourishment projects can directly damage or completely obliterate undiscovered sites lying on the continental shelf. The seafloor, once a remote frontier, is now a zone of intense economic activity. This creates a profound ethical tension for archaeologists, the ideal of preservation in situ, leaving a site untouched for future generations with better technology, is colliding with a harsh new reality. If a site is in the path of a proposed gas pipeline or is actively being eroded by stronger currents, leaving it alone means consigning it to certain destruction. The urgent need for rescue archaeology to excavate and document a site before it vanishes has never been greater. This work is painstakingly slow, expensive, and logistically challenging. It forces heartbreaking triage, deciding which sites can be saved and which must be recorded as thoroughly as possible before they are gone. Guiding this global effort is the 2001 UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage. This international agreement establishes a framework urging nations to preserve sites in their original location as a first option. It promotes non-destructive survey techniques like the sonar and robotics we discussed, and sets strict scientific standards for any excavation that must occur. Most importantly, it firmly states that underwater heritage should not be commercially exploited. The convention reframes these sunken places not as salvageable treasure, but as archaeological sites deserving the same careful study and respect as those on land. They are archives of human history lying in a particularly vulnerable library. The ethical challenge we face mirrors the physical one. It is a race against the rising tide. Do we document and recover what we can, knowing our methods are imperfect, or do we hold out hope for a future that may never come for these fragile ruins? The silent cities caught between research and loss ask us to consider what we value and how quickly we must act to learn from a past that is dissolving before our eyes. Even with all we have learned, the seafloor holds its deepest secrets close. For every sunken city we have mapped, countless others likely wait in the darkness, their stories still untold. The sheer scale of the drowned continental shelves presents a humbling frontier. How many more Pavlopetris or Thonis-Heracleions rest undiscovered, their outlines hidden under layers of sediment or simply beyond the reach of our current surveys? Each represents a missing chapter in the human story, a lost day to point in the climate record, and for the sites we have found, profound mysteries remain. Take the case of Dwaraka, where the line between geological event and cultural memory blurs. While evidence points to a catastrophic inundation, the precise sequence of its final days is still debated. Did a single tsunami deliver the final blow, or was it a series of punishing storms during a period of rapid sea level rise? Unlocking that timeline requires more than artifacts. It demands a finer reading of the seabed itself, one that might still be possible with new technologies. These questions lead to an even deeper inquiry, one about society itself. When the waters rose, not every community faced the same fate. What role did social structure, governance, and economic flexibility play in determining resilience? A highly centralized, rigid society dependent on a single port might shatter when that port fails. A more decentralized, adaptable coastal network might have been able to shift its trade routes, relocate its population, and find new ways to survive. The contrast invites us to look beyond the environmental trigger to the human response. Did the leaders of a doomed city cling to tradition and stone, investing in ever higher walls against an inevitable tide? Or did they recognize a losing battle and guide their people toward a managed retreat? The ruins alone cannot always answer this, but they prompt us to consider the social choices that amplify or soften the blow of environmental change. The pursuit of these answers has never been more active. Across the globe, new expeditions are launching, armed with tools that feel like science fiction. Autonomous underwater vehicles, or a UVS, now glide silently through the depths, programmed to survey vast grids of the seafloor with laser-like precision, creating three-dimensional maps of stunning detail. Sediment coring systems can now extract longer, deeper, and more pristine columns of Earth from the seabed, offering higher-resolution climate diaries than ever before. Perhaps most promising is the integration of artificial intelligence into the search. Machine learning algorithms can be trained to scan the massive datasets from sonar and satellite surveys, identifying subtle, human-made patterns in the topography that might escape even the most experienced human eye. They can cross-reference geological data with historical texts and archaeological finds from land, suggesting the most probable locations for a lost harbor. This is not about replacing the archaeologist, but about giving them a powerful new lens, one that can sift through the blue noise of the ocean to find the signal of a forgotten wall, a sunken road, a lost world. The search continues, driven by a simple truth. Every discovery recalibrates our understanding. Each new sunken city found is not just a trophy, it is a vital piece of evidence in the planet's long trial of climate and coast. It adds a name, a date, and a story to the graph, helping us see the patterns in the planet's past with greater clarity, so we might better navigate its uncertain future. What will the next dive reveal, and how will it change the story we tell about ourselves and the shifting world we call home? The silent stones beneath the waves hold a final, unifying truth. These sunken cities are far more than monuments to forgotten disasters. They are the Earth's own finely tuned instruments, recording the planet's climatic pulse across millennia with a precision no human chronicler could match. Each submerged quay is a data point, each drowned street a benchmark on the graph of environmental history. Together, they reveal a long and sobering narrative of human communities navigating the shifting boundary between land and sea, a story of ingenious adaptation, heartbreaking retreat, and at times unavoidable surrender to forces far greater than any empire. This historical perspective is not a distant curiosity. It is an urgent lens through which to view our present moment. The same forces that patiently drowned Pavlopetri and catastrophically sank Port Royal are active today, only now they are accelerated by our own hands. The past shows us that coastlines are not permanent, that societies can reach a tipping point where change outpaces their capacity to respond. This is the legacy written in water and stone, a clear-eyed warning from our ancestors who built on the shore. They could not see the full scale of the changes that would claim their homes, but we can. We have their ruins as proof and our science as a guide. The call from these silent cities is not one of despair, but of clarity. They ask us to look at our own glittering coastal centers with new eyes, to see them not as permanent fixtures, but as the latest chapters in an ancient, ongoing story. It is a story we are still writing, and the next lines will be determined by what we choose to learn from those who came before, and how wisely we decide to build upon this temporary, precious edge of the world.